Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome and to introduce Monima Chadha, who is our next keynote speaker. Monima is Professor of Indian Philosophy at Oxford. She trained in philosophy at Delhi University and also Monash University in Australia, and she's also held a distinguished fellowship at Cornell before coming to Oxford in 2024. And she works primarily in philosophy of mind, fascinatingly in both classical Indian and contemporary Western traditions, as I think we'll be hearing in the talk today. Her recent monograph, published in 2023, is Selfless Minds, published by OUP. And Monima's work explores conceptions of selfhood, or indeed no selfhood, in ways that span metaphysics and ethics, as well as philosophy of mind and consciousness. So, yeah, welcome to King's again, and welcome to this conference. We're really looking forward to hearing your talk, and delighted you can join us.
Thank you. Thank you to King's and thank you to everyone in the British Society for History of Philosophy for inviting me. I feel very honored to be here. To be honest, as Claire said, I don't think many people think of me as a historian of philosophy, so thank you for confusing me with one. I just do philosophy, pure and simple. I think, that's what got me going, and that still keeps me going. And I love it all. I've loved the conference so far. I must say I've been in very many places at big conferences, but probably this is my first one in Britain. And the quality of discussion and the quality of papers is just amazing. So well done, Britain. I'm honestly, very many in Australia as well as in the US. This has been the best I've ever attended in terms of the quality of the papers, the presenters, as well as the discussion. So thank you all. I hope this is somewhat interesting. Okay, so Claire mentioned about my book, Selfless Minds, and I was basically doing epistemology, philosophy of mind, thinking how we can think about everything in philosophy of mind without a self, because self plays a fairly important role in philosophy of mind. It's the subject of conscious thoughts, and it's the agent of action. And so I was just doing that, but Peter Momchiloff sort of twisted my arm to say, "You got to say something about ethics." And I said, "Okay." So I wrote this chapter. In it, please don't read that chapter. This is a warning thing. I've got this opportunity to speak to all of you. Please don't read that chapter. I wrote something, and then lots of people said to me, "That was really bad. What do you say about this? What do you say about that?" Because I hadn't really thought it through. And so since then, I've just been thinking through the ethics. So now it's kind of become, I've got to defend some of the things I said there. And I really believe, like what I did say, there was something right in it, or maybe part of it was right. So that's what I've been doing in my life since writing Selfless Minds, is been thinking about that chapter in ethics and how to think about ethics without a self now. How to think about ethics without a subject, and how to think about ethics without an agent of action. And that, kind of brings this problem. It's very central to ethics, is, responsible agency, moral agency, call it what you like. And I've been thinking about the Buddhist model and how they expect us to change our practices, or at least some of our practices. Simple example, Buddhists say anger is always irrational. No case of anger is justified. Anger against racial injustice, sexism, no case of anger is justified. Whereas some of us think that, in some cases, if I don't get angry, there's something wrong. There's something bad about not getting angry at some things. And so, how do you bring this together? I'm not a relativist at all. I don't think, Buddhists have one way of thinking about the world and doing their lives, and, we have another way. I think, there's one morality. I've got to figure out what's going on for, doing morality without a self. How do we even begin? And so that's this project. So first I was thinking about just practices. And then, of course, philosophers are very good. They come up with good objections. So they kept on telling me, boy, just practices isn't going to work. You've got to think about agency. You've got to think about responsible agency. The project's not going to work. And so, stupid me, I think, okay, I'm going to think about it. And so this is the result of thinking about kind of narrative views in philosophy. And I'll say something about I know you're expecting Buddhism, but I'm going to start with Parfit, because he was influenced by Buddhism, and I think some of his, especially when it came to ethics, some of his insights have been missed. So this is what he says in the concluding chapter of the book. Greater impersonality may seem threatening, but it would often be better for everyone. One of the implications of reductionism, which came out, very clearly, it does come out in the book, but it very clearly came out in the special issue on ethics in 1986 on Parfit's Reasons and Persons, in which he's responding to people. And he very clearly draws this conclusion about one of the implications of reductionism, which is no one truly deserves to be punished or blamed for their character or actions. And people thought, that is got to be wrong, right? How are you going to do morality without it? There's a recent book that's come out on Parfit, and I think Jeff McMahon has edited it, or you people. And if you read it, person after person goes on, especially Larry Temkin, who was a big friend of how people disagreed on this. Everyone thought, no, we deserve to be punished. And so I think, and we deserve to punish, both. We deserve to be punished, and we deserve to punish at times. Because I think the fear is that, without this there would be no morality, and there would be, no moral, without moral agents, without a persisting moral agent, there wouldn't be a self. And Buddhism faces that problem, right? They have no self, and then they have this, whole moral, ethical outlook. How are we going to bring that together? So that's the problem I'm thinking about. In contemporary philosophy, and this started with Christine Korsgaard's response to Parfit, you get, we can self-constitute ourselves. She wrote a paper in 1989, I think, in response to, we can ignore the metaphysics and we can self-constitute ourselves. It is in fact practically, not only necessary, it's required for us. For agency, we must construct a practical identity for ourselves. And this movement has kind of taken off in philosophy. She's got a very Kantian account of how we do the self-constitution. Not Kant's account, I have been told this morning, Kantian account. So she's got a very Kantian account, which I don't like, but there is the narrative self-response. And what is surprising is the narrative self-response, which, sort of draws on Korsgaard, is very popular in contemporary philosophy. So you get Anya Schechtman and lots of other people following her. It's also become popular amongst my Buddhist friends. Mm-hmm. I think, what? I've got to do something about this. So that's why, this crusade against the, I shouldn't call it that word. Anyway, crusade against the narrative self. Because what it means is we're not paying attention to the thing Parfit was worrying about and the thing the Buddhists worried about. Morality, moral agency, ordinary moral responsibility practices. We want to save them from the threat of reductionism. no change to our moral beliefs. You can do epistemology, you can go and construct things in your corner. Nobody else except you will worry about it. The philosophy department will worry, but no one else in the world is going to worry. This is serious. So the project is not to say that the Buddhists have got it right or Parfit had it right. The project is just to explore how we might think about moral responsibility, moral agency without a self, and whether we can, what kind of morality, what kind of direction it pushes us in. So it's just to work out the consequences at this stage. I'm not making a case that this is better than that. Our practices might be fine, but we better have justification for that, right? So Buddhism's got this similar thing. As I've said, no one deserves to be punished, and it's my favorite hero, Vasubandhu, who I think has this implication. Others draw it out too. I've already said contemporary philosophers. So I'm happy to talk about Shetman in the discussion. I'm not going to talk about her now. I'm going to talk about my fellow Buddhist philosophers, who work on this kind of thing. So Mark Sideritz is one person, Jay Garfield is another. Both of them favor versions of the narrative view. And I'm going to tell you why they're wrong and then say something in terms of a positive proposal. So there's 3 sections. I'll give you Vasubandhu's Buddhist no-self view, because you expect some Buddhist philosophy from me. I'll tell you about a problem with that. We'll talk about rejecting the narrative view. I think Maria Schechtman and lots of people in that group are realists about the self. They want to construct a real self. That's not an option we're looking at today, but I'm happy to discuss it. My focus will be on what I call fictionalism about the self, which is a Dennett kind of thing, and a moderate realism, which is Jay Garfield's variety of narrative. And then I'll try and say why they're wrong. And the third project, the reconfiguring model agency, that isn't done. That is where I would really like your help, to tell me how crazy it is. If it is really crazy, it might be. I suspect at times it is crazy. Other times I feel convinced by it. So I guess that's how you do philosophy, right? You sometimes feel, I've got it. And then other times you feel, oh no. So anyway, that kind of is only suggestions. Okay, let's start with this. All of us know that, there's the Buddhist no-self view. They deny that there is a metaphysical soul substance or an Atman that accounts for identity over time. All Buddhist views deny that. And this common perception is right, but I think it's incomplete. Buddhists, or at least some Buddhists, also target our intuitive conception, the sense of self, as the experiencer and the agent of action that is in control of the mind-body complex. That notion of, whatever it is that controls the mind-body complex is the notion of the agent. In this sense of self, or, sense of identity, personal identity, practical identity, is the problem. It's an illusion we need to get rid of. This is my favorite chap, and it's the best photo I can find of him. There are 2 books in particular that I'm familiar with. He's written a lot, as they did in those times, so much so that there's even, talk about, was he one person or 2? Where there are 2 different Vasubandhus living in 2 different times because he changed his mind so much. I think that's a good thing for a philosopher. If they've changed their mind, you have some confidence that, they've been persuaded by the arguments. But anyway, I'm going to look at these 2 texts, the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya and the Karma Siddhi Prakaran. Both have got something to do with action. Okay, so this is Vasubandhu's argument in the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya against the Hindu objections. So this is, slightly simplified. So those of you who know the text, please excuse me. So the N is the Nyaya philosopher who has these objections against Vasubandhu. There being no self, who is the doer of the deeds and who is the enjoyer of their fruit? And Vasubandhu says, what is the meaning of doer? And the Nyaya says the doer is the one who does, the enjoyer is the one who enjoys. This was very common in Indian philosophy. You just give the meaning and dismiss your opponent's objection. And Vasubandhu does not like this. These are mere synonyms and explain nothing about their meaning. So the Nyaya has to say something meaningful. So here's what they come up with. The doer is the one who's autonomous. For example, in terms of physical actions, bathing, eating, and walking, Devadatta, a proper name like John, like Claire, is Devadatta would be a proper name in those times. Is we call them the bather, eater, and the walker. This definition is not acceptable, says Vasubandhu. Why not? And this is the reason he gives. What is meant by Devadatta? If it is a self that is meant, that's what it is at issue. We're discussing the self, so you can't tell me that the Devadatta means the self, stands for the self. It's worthless. The example is not yet established. If it is the complex of the 5 psychophysical aggregates, so it's the mental and physical complex, the whole psychophysical complex that a person is, if it is that complex that is meant, then Devadatta is indeed an agent, but he is not autonomous. Because, according to the Buddhists, psychophysical aggregates are not enduring, one thing, and the other thing is they're not autonomous. The the mental states come into being from the physical states, that is, sort of dehydration in the body makes you feel thirsty. Your brain gets the signal, and you have a mental state of feeling thirsty. You go for, a beer in the fridge or water, if you're more sensible. Anyway, so they're not autonomous, and mental states cause physical states cause bodily states, and so on and so forth. Autonomous means, something like a substance here in the background that has independent existence, and so on and so forth. And then Vasubandhu continues, if it's just the psychophysical aggregates, they're not autonomous. If it is the substance you mean, we haven't established it yet. Therefore, no doer is characterized as autonomous. No doer characterized as autonomous is apprehended. That which is the dominant cause of something is called its doer, but the self is not found to be a cause with respect to anything. Therefore, there cannot thus be a self. So what he has here is an argument for no self based on what I call the causal efficacy principle, which is, to be is to be causally efficacious. Those of you who know your Quine, to be is to be the value of a bound variable. This is much better. To be is to be causally efficacious. That's what I think if you have to, if something cannot be known by perception. Here's the argument in whole. If there's no empirical reason to believe in the existence of the thing, and you've got a positive, you better tell us why you're positing it. Positing gravity is all right, because there's a lot of reason to posit gravity. It explains the behavior of objects. What reason do you have to postulate the self? According to Vasubandhu, not enough good reason. So self doesn't do anything. It's not causally efficacious, so we shouldn't accept it. I like his analogy, and you should remember it. Self is like a mantra of a quack doctor. If there's anything that is doing the work, it's the herbs. But if you're, in India and been to a quack doctor, they will also make a lot of noise and chant a lot of mantras. You can ignore them. Self is like that. You can totally ignore it. Okay, here's Vasubandhu's account of action without a self. So again, going back to India, and I'm sorry for those who've heard this example before, but I love it. Nothing works so well in my mind. So this is, suppose you're in a market in India. You've been there in the summer. This is the end of summer. This is like July, August, at the end of summer. And you get this special breed of mangoes. It is just so good. You can smell it in the air. You've got to go there in July, and you've got to have this mango. Send me an email. I'll send you a reply, which mango to look for. You're in the market. You smell, the air is infused with that mango. You or you've had this mango before and you really want it. So given, this is an example to illustrate Vasubandhu as us. From recollection, there is interest. Given this recollection of the taste of mango, just on seeing that mango, your mouth is watering, you're back all those years, really wanting to grab that. From recollection, there is interest. There is interest in procuring the mango. From interest, consideration. Obvious way, go and pay for it and buy it. You put your hand into your pocket, you haven't got the money. You haven't brought your wallet. It's your last night in India. You're flying out this evening. You desperately want this mango. You know you can run. Some of us are very good runners, especially at Oxford. Everyone runs at Oxford. Anyway, or maybe in Britain, that's more. I just saw lots of people running in London in the morning, and I thought, what? But anyway, I haven't been to London many times, but I was a little bit shocked in the morning. Anyway, from interest, there is consideration. From consideration, you realize you haven't got the money. You are a good runner. And from consideration, there arises deliberate, willful effort or a decision. You make a decision, you're going to get the mango. Somehow, you're going to steal it. And from that decision of wanting to steal the mango, there arises vital energy, kind of a current. When you make your decision to do something bad, you kind of feel the nervous energy in you. And from that vital energy, action. And Vasubandhu says he's a bunch of mental states. What does the self have to do here? Recollection, interest, consideration, willful effort, vital energy, mental and physical states, bodily action. I've explained it. Where's the need for the self? There's a problem, and the Hindus point out that, the Buddhists are committed to no self, and the Buddhists are committed to karma. Karma is their equivalent of, moral responsibility in some sense. The important thing about karma is its consequences in the future. You don't get blamed or punished straight away. It could be another lifetime. I don't want to go into that right now, but it's at least in the non-immediate future, right? But then, the question is, if there's no agent of actions over and above the causally connected mental and physical states, and there is no identity over time, who's going to be the enjoyer of karma? There's no agent, there's no moral agent, who's going to be responsible? The Hindus did ask this question. It seems that there are no moral agents. Vasubandhu does have a reply, and his reply, and this is the last thing I'm going to say about Vasubandhu, does not refer to conventional persons. Conventional persons is what my Buddhist friends have started constructing using the narrative view. They think, we should, Buddhist has this thing about there being conventional persons. I'll say a little more about them in a minute. But Vasubandhu gives a kind of agricultural analogy. From seed, there arises fruit. And he never mentions anything about persons here. He's talking about the important thing here is the thing in blue. Karma has to be worked out as a distinctive feature of the transformation of the continuum of mental and physical states. Whatever moral responsibility is, it's got to be worked out as a transformation of the continuum. There is no need to have an enduring person or a self, as the Hindus think. So yes, the Buddhists believe in conventional persons. Vasubandhu also has something to say about conventional persons, but he doesn't think conventional persons can be responsible agents, can be moral agents. I don't think he thinks that. Otherwise, he would have said something here. So I read this as saying exactly what Parfit was saying. No one is responsible, no one deserves to be punished, and there is no reference to conventional persons here. Anyway, so the possible solution, as I said, is we come up with narrative self or conventional persons according to my Buddhist friends. And what what Garfield says, that, moral agency requires us to invent or create persisting persons who have values. Like, that's what it is to be a moral agent. You've got to have your values that, drive your actions. Your projects should be more or less, more, and commitment. I mean, these things, values, projects, commitment, all of them don't sound very selfie to me. But apparently, the claim is, in order to have these things, you need to have a self. You need to postulate an enduring person. So what I want to argue is that these views, these narrative views, are epistemically suspect. And I'm not going to say much about the epistemically suspect because of time, but it's ethically questionable because they're inherently conservative. And I'll explain why I think, just go on, business as usual, as far as our moral practices go. And that's enough of a reason to think these things are questionable. Okay, so here are the three kinds of views. I'm not going to look at the realist view today. I'm only going to say a little bit about fictionalism. And I think it's very similar to Dennett's view. And so that might help people to see what I'm saying. And then we'll move to Jay Garfield's view. So here's an important distinction between self and person. I mean, in contemporary philosophy, it's not always distinguished, but it's very important for the Buddhists to distinguish these two ideas. And here's the basic distinction. The self, or the Atman, as it is called, is the simple soul substance, which is the essence of the psychophysical complex. It's the unitary subject of experience and the agent of actions and the enjoyer of karma. It is eternal, persisting within and across lifetimes. Even in liberation, according to the Hindus, the self persists, not according to the Buddhists. Persons, or Pudgala, as it's called, is the psychophysical complex as a whole. Persons are complex things, they're not simple substances, and their existence depends on the psychophysical complex, but it's something over and above the psychophysical complex. So although they're not eternal, they're meant to persist within and across lifetimes, and they exist, most Buddhists say, they exist only conventionally, that is, they're only conceptual constructions, something we create, except Pudgalvadins. And my dear colleague Amber has written a wonderful book, if you want to find out about various views from the Buddhists about persons, Indian Buddhist Philosophy, 2014. I really recommend it. More than reading Selfless Minds, honest. Okay, so here's Dennett on a chapter he calls in his 2015 rewrite of, Free Will Reconsidered. He calls the chapter Self-Made Selves. So selves have to be thought of as centers of narrative gravity. I hope some of you have heard of this, but the idea is this. Narrative, these strings that's of streams of narrative that issue forth as if from a single source. So when people tell you who they are, or how they're constituted, they have a story to tell. And Dennett says these narratives not only are coming from a single source in the obvious physical sense, but in a more subtle sense. And the subtle sense is their effect on the audience is to encourage them to posit a unified agent whose words they are, about whom they are. In short, to posit a narrative, a center of gravity. So Dennett doesn't think there is a real self or, a real enduring soul pellet somewhere. Dennett is a physicalist. He thinks we posit a self because we want a unified agent. We want others to believe there is a unified agent. And he's very open about it. Why do we want to do it? Why encourage others to posit a unified self if there isn't one? Why should we do it? If it's brain states coming together to do this kind of thing, why should we mislead others? It is to uphold our moral responsibility practices. Dennett is big on that. Free will, moral responsibility, it has to be upheld at all costs. We've got to bring it together with the scientific picture of the world. Sideritz has got a similar idea, he thinks persons are useful fictions. Same line, along the same lines as Dennett. Exactly this. So if eliminating the belief in the self is important to the project of overcoming suffering, that's the Buddhist project, why stop at half measures concerning the person? And then he goes back to the text. One example given in the text is that of a criminal who does not appropriate. This is important. I want to come back. It's not a matter of ascribing states to oneself. It is a matter of appropriating mental states. Taking what is not one's own. Appropriating earlier and later parts of the series. I did that. Why do we appropriate? Why do the Buddhists encourage you? Well, some Buddhists encourage you to appropriate earlier and later parts of the series. Predictably, Sideritz thinks that this individual, if this individual fails to take responsibility for his past crime and sees his punishments as unjustified, persists in criminal behavior after release. We don't want to encourage that. What we want to encourage is something like the personhood concept, a useful fiction like the narrative self, who can take responsibility, just as you take ownership of your actions. You take ownership of your actions, so you can take responsibility for your actions. That's Sideritz. And then here's what I see the problem with this account of action. This useful fiction idea is selves don't do anything. We just saw in Masubandhu's account, and Dennett and Sideritz both agree that selves are causally important. In fact, there's nothing like the self. It's just like a center of gravity. You can't put all the furniture as well as the center of gravity into the truck. You put the furniture, the center of gravity is already there. The psychophysical complex is all there is. If the selves are, causally impotent, then they didn't do anything. Do they really deserve? Is it justified that we hold them responsible? I think all we can say is, accept openly. We want to save our practices as they are, like Dennett does. Don't think anything good is being done by, faking it. That, there is a person there who can take, ownership of actions and we can hold them responsible. And two important Buddhist philosophers, Nagarjuna and Shantideva, both disagree about, punishment being justifiable. As Nagarjuna says, punishment might be necessary, he doesn't deny that, but you can't give justification that it's deserved. So there's no excuse for treating criminals badly or because they deserve it. There's no excuse for anger. Anger is totally irrational, says Shantideva. I don't think, Buddhists have to give up on this fact that offenders don't deserve to be punished because they're not autonomous and they're not persisting selves or persons. I'm going to move on to Garfield now. So Garfield has this more complex account. So persons are constituted not just in dependence on the psychophysical complex, like Sideritz. There's a little more to his story. So we are constituted as persons. We are in part by the continuum of psychophysical processes. He grants that. By the social complexes in which we figure and which shape us. So he's going broader with the supervenience base, not just the psychophysical complex, but the broader social context in which you are, the institutions, the roles you play, and in virtue of the conventions of individuation and the description of ownership and responsibility. 3, I find particularly worrying. It's openly saying, following my conventions. I've got to save my conventions, the way we individuate each other, description of ownership and responsibility. Kind of an open admission of what's going on here. But Buddhists want to question our ordinary practices. I just gave you 2 examples. No one deserves to be punished. Anger is irrational. It's normal, it's what we do, but it's not on, they say. So I think I'm going to cut this short a little bit. So just a couple of things about Garfield. Garfield wants to say persons are enduring. They're not just, ever changing. Our identity endures through change. It is not because we are separate from the institution's relations, narrative, the broader social context and embodiment that brings us into existence. So it's broader than the psychophysical base. The other thing is, for Garfield, we are not just fictions. That's why he called it a moderate realism, because we are, he says, embodied, embedded, and inactive in our world. We are doing things. So we are part of the causal nexus. And so we are moral agents who can be held responsible. So here's what Garfield thinks he's achieved. By rejecting autonomy, which, yes, the Buddhists want to reject, by rejecting a foundational self and by rejecting independence in favor of an interdependent person with a constructed identity, Buddhist gives us a more easily naturalized account of agency. I don't think so, because there's one important pillar of the no-self, the Buddhist no-self view, which is totally missing from here, and which is the notion of impermanence. That's very important, a central doctrine. We are not persisting persons according to Buddhists. We are interdependent. You got that fact right. But we are also transient, some would say momentary entities. Garfield is big on thinking that, getting the metaphysics right. So he's not saying, forget about the metaphysics like Sideritz or Dennett. He says, get the metaphysics right, and that should change our attitude about the kinds of persons we want to be. So our moral attitudes and our moral development are bound up with our view of our own natures. If we think of ourselves as interdependent persons, not autonomous, we will change the way we behave. And so he says, who we think we are determines in part who we eventually become. But there is, who we eventually become. That means it is the same person. And that's, what does it mean to, sort of take control of the kind of person you want to be? According to Buddhists, it's doing these very natural things you might think, are good things, which is what they call good states or wholesome states. Gratitude, humility, you've got to cultivate gratitude, humility, generosity, forbearance, all of those things. And you've got to get rid of negative or unwholesome states, such as hatred, which is the root of anger and resentment, greed, which is the root of jealousy, and so on, and the delusion, the belief in the self. All of those lead to unwholesome states. So that much sounds right. Get rid of false metaphysical beliefs, get rid of greed, get rid of hatred. But then, if you've achieved all that, you can perhaps make more progress and then go for a more radical moral transformation, which culminates in becoming a bodhisattva, which means developing compassion and care for all beings. And this is exactly what Garfield thinks it requires this taking on the Bodhisattva project, taking on this kind of moral transformation requires building a moral identity. So this is, in a later paper, Garfield and Emily McRae have this idea. What is the chapter 7 of the famous Buddhist text, Bodhicharya Avatara, is doing? And he thinks that it tells us about that radical transformation which requires a commitment to the Bodhisattva project And this is an example how commitment, which is just a mental state, I have no problem with commitment. Commitments are fine. It's just how it gives you an identity. Commitment organizes my life. It defines not only what I do, but who I am. The Bodhisattva vow organizes one's life. Commitment enables it to do so. To be committed to the Bodhisattva project is hence to take oneself seriously as a model agent, first and foremost, and to subordinate the rest of one's life to that identity. Commitment is about our orientation to the model life and our senses of our model agency. So that's what commitment does, build a model. I think there are two reasons to reject that view. One is, if I think about the internal structure of the text, in chapter 6, the Bodhi of the text, Shantideva is telling us you should not get angry. That's the famous chapter on anger, against anger. His way of doing is depersonalizing the agency of others. If someone hurts you, just think of them. The kinds of analogies when you have a upset system, the bile. We don't get angry at the bile. We don't get angry at sticks that hurt us. We get angry at sentient beings. His strategy there is depersonalizing the agency of sentient beings. They are also a result of causes and conditions. So why should we get angry of them? Like natural objects. Persons are like natural objects. Chapter 8, again, he says we have a reason to protect all sentient beings from suffering because of the symmetry between our future self and other selves. And this is the simple argument he gives for this symmetry. He says, you think, your suffering is more important because it hurts you, but your future suffering doesn't hurt you right now, but you care about that. I don't, smoke, let's say, or, do some other things that sound very interesting because I think that's going to hurt my future self, It's going to be terrible for my future self, so I try to protect my future self. But I don't feel that pain. Why do I try to why not protect the suffering of others, right? They're also suffering. It's not hurting you, but they're suffering just like you. Anyway, so he's questioning the difference, the separateness of persons. And if this is what he's doing, he's urging us to undo our sense of self. Why would he, in chapter 7, say, go and build up a moral identity? So I can tell you how to break it apart in chapter 8. I don't get it. Anyway, another reason when you think about, Garfield and McRae giving this is, they say it structures my life. Why? Because the structure and hierarchy, moral identity is necessary to sustain the structure and hierarchy of goals and values that drive our conduct and that shapes our lives. Hierarchy, goals and values, desires, Frankfurt. That's, the kind of view we need. If I'm going to be a moral agent, I've got to have a driving commitment to accept that that's the commitment that sits at the top. That's what defines my identity as a moral agent. That's not the Buddhist view of agency at all. Not any Buddhist view of agency, I think. They're not into hierarchical. They think we have very little knowledge of our own minds and very little control over our own minds. They don't think we know, we don't know anything about our minds, but we know very little. So I think, a Buddhist model of agency, and I'm very pleased, Amber, you're nodding, our actions emerge out of a rich set of psychological factors, drives, beliefs, desires, motivations, impulses, principles, fantasies, reasons, all of that is in the mix, but all of which are imperfectly known and imperfectly controlled. It's not a tidy picture that we like. And if that's the picture, I don't think, we should go for the nice hierarchy of values that Garfield and so, I have nothing against the Buddhist idea that we should have commitment. I just don't think we should think of commitment as something that helps me to identify my project because I think that's what the problem is. If over and above having a moral project, having the project of doing good in the world, I seem to think it's my project. I start thinking it's my project, it's going to bring in the sorts of things that the Buddhists tried to get rid of, the unwholesome traits. Once you identify with something as your project, you think, well, when it's not going well, frustration, self-contempt. The Buddhists say self-contempt is dependent on the self. Pride, the opposite of self-contempt, that is also dependent on the self. Don't let these things come in. So my project is going to bring in my problems. And the Buddhist is not in favor of that. I mean, look at this quote from yet another Buddhist philosopher. I hope you've seen it before. Misery does only exist, none miserable. No doer is there, naught save the deed is found. Nirvana is liberation, enlightenment, whatever, is but not the man who seeks it. The path exists, but not the traveler on it. Bodhisattva path, no traveler. So, and I think, I said I'm only going to talk about the ethical quest, that this person construction is ethically questionable. I've given you, internal reasons from Buddhism why we should reject it. There's some other reasons. Schechtman, in her first book, ends up saying enlightened Buddhists are not persons because they have no awareness. You need something like a narrative self in order to be persons. It's self, you self-constitute yourself. She's got a quote which suggests, exactly this. And I find that, for the tradition, enlightened Buddhists are the ideal moral agents. Something must be going wrong for her to think if they don't have a narrative, they're not self. Think about this other problem. It's not just the special Buddhists, the enlightened ones who may not exist. Deeply traumatized people, their narrative breaks down. People who are recovering addicts, they often say one of the things that's gone wrong is their narrative has broken down. Extremely poor people. Now think about a person who, is exhausted by thinking about their next meal, what they're going to eat. Not people like you and me. They're extremely poor people. They don't have narratives. They don't have a plan of life, a hierarchy of values organizing their structure. It's the most immediate concerns. But they're endeavoring to be moral agents. And the recovering addict, someone who's striving from rape or trauma or other kinds of trauma. Lots of, stories you read about those people. They're in fact better than you and me in terms of being moral agents because they realize how little they control. The book by Bryson, I don't know if you've looked at this, Susan Bryson, absolutely, interesting account of personal identity. What happens to personal identity? And worth looking at. So is Picard's paper. I think it's 2021 in Noose about addiction. They're surely moral agents. If, this narrative view, without having this kind of project that you commit yourself to and, that organizes your life, if you're not going to be a moral agent, I don't like that conception of moral agency. So I suggest a way forward. We give up on the illusions of the narrative view. I'm going to finish soon. I told you this part is very badly done, so I put it in the end, so I have to finish soon. I want to get some inspiration from the Buddhist story literature. You don't get much in Buddhist texts, in the scholarly literature, but there's a story literature which is just as important. And I just want to I haven't done much work, but I just want to get a little snippet from there to get you to think about how they're thinking about agency, how they're thinking about moral agency without and transformation, without compromising on either the impermanence or the interdependence, and thinking about without thinking about persisting persons. And one kind of stories, there's at least three distinct traditions: the Jatak, the Divyadanas, and the Dhammapada. But I want to give you This is a quote from Sarah Shaw, who works in particular on the Jataks. And I just want you to, the structure of the Jatak stories is interesting. So they're meant to be stories about the many lives of the Buddha. They like reincarnation. So they have a certain pattern. This is how it's done. A tale from the present that describes the exemplary Buddha in the third person. This is followed by a tale from the past about a third person character, the Bodhisattva, an earlier self related by the Buddha. So it's, the Buddha telling the story. Only at the end does the story finish with aham eva, thus was I. The Buddha's acknowledgement of his relationship with the earlier state. Not person, earlier states. So in the tale of the one person recounting his previous lives, this is the all-knowing Buddha. Not you and me, we can't do that. But the important thing is how the personhood and the personal pronouns shift across the three characters. There's one other Buddha in the third person, there is a one Bodhisattva, and there is the first person Buddha. And they're all, thus was I, he remembers at the very end of the tale. This narrative technique, I think, is telling us something. And what it's telling us is, this way of doing it. So getting a first person perspective, there's a perspective of the, you sometimes get an insight into the internal struggles and deliberations in the past life of the Buddha, but without any sense of knowing who the Buddha is, who, in the sense of the moral agent the Buddha is. There's no sense of knowing the person as a whole. There is just, what happens in situations. These are examples of sometimes exemplary actions, sometimes before he became a Buddha, not such an exemplary action, and there are kind of things like he fell in love with a married woman or something like that. You get those examples in the and you also get lots of different forms, not just human forms, not just other persons, but sometimes a bodhisattva can be a bird, an elephant, a deer. So all those various forms are reincarnations in some sense, or in the end the Buddha says, that was I, with this project of becoming a bodhisattva. So I don't think there is any way of tying these stories together and structuring in many psychological lives of the many distinctive reincarnations that the Buddha seems to be remembered into a stable and a psychological whole, like the narrative theorists accept us to, do. There is no such person, but still you have a conception of moral agency. It is irrelevant to them whether it's the same person or not. It's just thinking about, what happens on individual occasions and how you work your way through various dilemmas. If there are no persisting agents, and I don't think we need them, we'll need to reconfigure. This is the last thing I'm going to say. We have to reject the backward-looking question. Why did she do it? What was her mental state then? According to, how I understand the Buddhists, we should reject that question and ask, why did that happen? What was the circumstances, the interdependent person, depending on their context? What was the circumstance that brought it about? What can we do as a group, to stop this happening? I mean, just a simple example. Sometimes too many accidents happen, and then we think of, as a group, let's have a speed limit or something like that. Drink driving rules came into existence like that, at least. I think the important question is focus on the present, the intentional state of the agent now, not what it was then. When we are thinking about responsibility, we should, does the agent really feel regret now? What are they going to do about it? I mean, spending time on figuring out what was the intention then. I think it's much better to spend time on figuring out, what kind of agent is this thing now, and what can we do? That should work out how we assign responsibility. Focus on the future. wholesome states need to be encouraged and developed. It is irrelevant when and where they are. This might remind you of Harvard again. Won't go into that. I'll just end with this quote. Again, this quote, the top one is from Parfit, and he says, the question, who has an experience, is as irrelevant as the question when the experience was had. I've just reformulated it in Buddhist terms, but you can read it. Thank you. That's all I've had to say. Leave that
on. Thank you so much, Monima. That was just a fantastic talk. And I feel like you're in the right place. I was thinking about the Spinozas in the room at least, given that Spinoza also thinks that human individuals are not cells or substances, and yet he wrote the Ethics, which is trying to figure out what ethical life could be like under those conditions. And then I really loved that turn you took at the end to storytelling and life writing and literary form and narrative technique. I think that's exactly the right way to go on this.
Thank you.
Anyway, enough of this. Amber would like to ask a question. Yeah.
Thank you, Monima. That's fantastic. I'm going to try to restrain myself because there's so much I want to talk to you about. So first of all, Buddhist philosophy is radical. Thank you. It does not leave everything in its place. And if that's where our interpretations got us to, it's off the rails. So thank you. I think that's really important. And so I had two question suggestions. One is, I think we talked about this, turning to narratives, I think is a really good resource for ideas. I don't know that I would get that you do out of the Jatakas, out of those tales, but one of the general principles that might be helpful is to think about what it is. So Monima Chadha has this wonderful account of how literature is morally relevant, or even is moral philosophy, completely embedded in an agent-centered Aristotelian conception of what it is to be moral. And to think about these Buddhist narratives and all the way that they are stylistically, not just in content, but also in content, different from the sorts of things that Martha Nussbaum picks out, I think helps to highlight how they're working in a no-self way. So that's a kind of a general thing that is quite fruitful. I want to make a radical suggestion that maybe
bring it on.
Maybe we should reject the question. Maybe just as Buddhist philosophy decenters blame, they decenter justice, they decenter agency. Ethical life and ethics isn't centered on agency. And when we recenter it the way they do, you can say things about agency and responsibility, but it's not like that's the core of your account of ethics. That's just something that fits into the overall picture. I wondered if, a lot of the things that you were saying seem kind of sympathetic.
Yeah, I think I am thinking along those lines. In the sense, I really want to reject the backward-looking sense of agency that is very important to the responsibility literature. But I do think the Buddhists want to leave open this idea that you can have a moral life and a moral project.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So whether we should think of it as a moral agency, maybe I should just, dump the whole thing. I used to think there is no agent. I had no problem saying that there is no agent, because agency doesn't require having a self. A minimal account of agency does not require having a self. There's a wonderful paper by Nick Shea, if you haven't read it again. I think it came out this year, which makes the point very cleanly and nicely, looking at the empirical literature. Agency doesn't require a self. So, why should we think moral agency requires a self? So I think, maybe we can save agency, but it's not important to me to save agency. What is important to me is to save the Buddhist ethical outlook. There is an ethical project there. There is an